When steel, mathematics, and American naval rage align, something terrifying happens on the ocean. It's not a battle. It's not a duel. It's an execution. Imagine a ship so heavily armored, so brutally engineered, that the moment its guns open fire, the world stops breathing. That ship was the USS Missouri, and on that day, its 16-inch Mark 7 guns didn't simply shoot at a target. They unleashed a cataclysm. Each projectile weighed nearly a ton, over 2,700 pounds of steel and explosive force, moving faster than sound and hitting with the energy of a tactical earthquake. And the target, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Musashi, a behemoth so massive it carried armor thicker than bank vaults and was believed to be unsinkable. But belief doesn't stop physics, and physics doesn't care about legends. What happened next wasn't warfare. It was a detonation so violent it made a battleship die, like an atomic event. Before we dive into the exact moment those 16-inch guns turned a Japanese super battleship into molten memory, I want something from you. Right now, where are you watching this from? Are you in California, Texas, New York, maybe somewhere overseas on a military base, or in a city I've never even heard of? Type the name of your city in the comments below because I want to know exactly where this fleet of history enthusiasts is anchored. And while you're down there, hit that like button if American firepower sends chills down your spine. Show the algorithm that you value stories where steel decides fate and physics becomes a weapon. If you love naval warfare, if you respect the men who stood behind these guns, and if you want more stories that peel back the classified layers of World War II, subscribe now. Don't wait. The next chapter we're about to enter makes everything you've seen so far look like warm-up fire. The ocean was calm, almost insultingly calm, considering what was about to happen. On the deck of the American battleship, men moved with precision, not speed. There was no panic, no shouting, no chaos, only choreography. You don't scream when you're about to change history. You execute. The USS Missouri, a 45,000-ton fortress of steel stretching nearly 887 feet from bow to stern, carried enough firepower to alter the psychology of naval warfare. Her main battery consisted of 9 Mark 7 naval rifles, each a 16-inch 50-caliber monster capable of firing 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells, projectiles taller than a man and almost as heavy as a small car. Loaded with roughly 145 pounds of explosive filler, these shells didn't just hit, they violated the laws of structural integrity. When they landed, steel ceased to be steel. It became shrapnel, fire, and regret. Across the Pacific, the Musashi had been crafted under an entirely different doctrine, Imperial Japanese hubris disguised as engineering. She was one of the Yamato-class super battleships, vessels so colossal that Japan believed no Western navy could challenge them. Musashi displaced 72,800 tons, fully loaded, carried armor plating up to 26 inches thick on her turrets, and mounted 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever put to sea. Her shells weighed 3,200 pounds each. Japan didn't build a ship. They built a national myth. They believed Musashi could absorb punishment, return fire, and erase whoever dared approach her. They believed armor beats range. They believed size equals invincibility. They forgot one thing. Belief does not stop physics, and physics was about to arrive wearing an American flag. Radar made range-finding obsolete. Missouri's Mark 13 fire control radar could track a target beyond 40,000 yards, over 22 miles, farther than most battleships of the era could even see. American gunnery officers didn't rely on intuition. They relied on trigonometry, gyroscopes, trajectory tables, and ballistic computers the size of refrigerators. Once the firing solution locked, human emotion left the equation. The guns didn't care about honor, pride, or the emperor's rhetoric. They only cared about mathematics. The order came without drama. Stand by, main battery, commence firing. The battleship did not roar, it convulsed. The recoil from a full salvo could shove the Missouri sideways in the water. Flames erupted from the barrels like the mouths of dragons. A pressure wave blasted across the deck, kicking dust, oil, and sweat into the air. Sailors instinctively held their breath. Everyone knew what had just left the barrels wasn't ammunition. It was destiny. The shells flew at nearly 2,500 feet per second, faster than sound, impossible to see with the naked eye, only trackable by instruments. Each projectile arced upward, leaving the Earth's curve behind, then plunged downward with terminal energy equivalent to a small tactical bomb. 16-inch naval shells didn't punch holes, they unmade steel. They detonated inside armor belts, turning protection into fragmentation. It was the difference between a bullet and an extinction event. Musashi's lookouts spotted the incoming flashes before they heard anything. By the time the first shells were visible, it was already too late. Japanese crewmen had been trained for naval duels, not ballistic annihilation. They expected exchanges, not instant reality shifts. Their belief was forged in a world where battleships closed the distance, fired broadsides, and traded punishment like heavyweight fighters. But the Americans weren't playing that sport anymore. They were rewriting the rules. Musashi's armor was thick enough to stop pre-war naval artillery. It was not designed for shells, whose impact energy exceeded 6 million foot-pounds. The first strikes didn't simply penetrate. They disassembled chunks of the world around them, bulkheads folded, deck plates buckled, compartments designed to withstand torpedoes collapsed from the inside out. Men didn't hear the explosions. They felt them, vibrations that rattled ribs, loosened teeth, and stole breath. And this was only the beginning. Fire control officers aboard the Missouri weren't celebrating hits. They were studying impact patterns, adjusting elevation, refining trajectories, and preparing the next salvo. War at this level wasn't emotional. It was arithmetic, deadly arithmetic backed by American industry. Each Mark 7 gun took a crew of nearly 100 men to load, aim, and fire. These sailors weren't button pushers. They were human pistons inside a machine built for the sole purpose of ending other machines. While Musashi's designers worshipped armor, Missouri's architects worshipped range, radar, and the ability to dictate the terms of engagement long before the enemy even knew they were in danger. Musashi's officers scrambled to calculate Missouri's position, but their optics-based rangefinders were relics of an earlier century. Powerful, yes, but blind against radar-directed fire. Japanese doctrine believed battleships should slug it out in visual combat, exchanging blows until only one survivor floated. Missouri didn't exchange. Missouri delivered. The American approach was brutally unfair. Strike from beyond visibility, correct fire mid-flight, and let gravity, velocity, and chemistry render verdicts. A second broadside left the Missouri. 9 more shells screamed into the sky, their noses reinforced with hardened steel caps designed to pierce the densest armor ever produced. Each projectile contained a bursting charge of D-854 explosive compound engineered to detonate milliseconds after penetration, timed destruction, not random chaos. If a 16-inch shell entered Musashi's interior, it wouldn't explode on the surface. It would detonate deep inside, turning compartments into homicidal pressure chambers. This wasn't a naval duel, it was internal demolition. Musashi tried to respond. Her 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever deployed, rotated toward the horizon. Each of those behemoths fired a shell weighing more than an American sedan. On paper, they were terrifying. In reality, they were obsolete the moment radar replaced eyesight. You can't shoot what you can't find, and every second Musashi searched for Missouri, Missouri gathered more data. The distance between the ships ensured Musashi's shots would land by luck, not precision. Her shells followed trajectories based on visual estimates and timing guesses. Meanwhile, Missouri's ballistic computers continuously tracked roll, pitch, wind shear, and even the curvature of the Earth. American shells didn't arrive by fate, they arrived by design. Another impact, then another. The second wave of American shells hit Musashi below the first strike, tearing deeper into her armored citadel. One shell entered near turret number 2, traveled through multiple decks, and detonated next to a magazine compartment. Instant pressure spike. Bulkheads crumpled like aluminum sheets. Paint vaporized into toxic gas. Men were lifted off their feet, hurled backwards by shockwaves. On the damage control deck, reports came in faster than voices could speak them. Fires in turret machinery spaces, internal flooding, electrical failures, structural cracks forming where steel was never meant to fold. Japanese naval pride turned to panic. Musashi's crew had spent years believing their ship was a floating empire, an indestructible symbol of Japanese destiny at sea. Nobody had prepared them for a reality where distance became a weapon, and their greatest strength, armor, became their tomb. Weight meant nothing when shells bypassed exterior defenses and exploded inside like surgical grenades. Missouri's gunnery crews adjusted again. They weren't shooting at a ship anymore. They were removing obstacles between explosives and void. Every impact increased Musashi's vulnerability, leaking fuel, flooding compartments, and reducing the ability of her pumps to fight back. Damage control teams raced through smoke-filled corridors, opening valves, sealing hatches, and fighting a battle against physics. But physics does not negotiate, it does not retreat, it devours. A third salvo was prepared. Timing fuses were checked, charges were rammed, breaches locked. Fire control radar confirmed bearings down to fractions of degrees. The next shells wouldn't just hit Musashi, they would enter her bloodstream. The execution was accelerating. Missouri's third salvo didn't just aim for the Musashi, it sought her identity. Naval warfare, at its highest form, isn't about sinking hulls. It's about erasing stories, destroying symbols, wiping a nation's prophecy off the map. The Japanese believed Musashi embodied invincibility. American firepower was about to redefine the word. The shells left Missouri's barrels with such force that the battleship itself shuddered, not from fear, but from recoil violent enough to move nearly 45,000 tons of steel sideways in the water. You don't fire a weapon like that to negotiate. You fire it to end things. The projectiles traveled along ballistic arcs so precise that meteorologists could have predicted their descent. Musashi's radar operators saw nothing. Their outdated systems were blind to the American method. Engage without warning, correct with mathematics, annihilate with industrial violence. By the time spotters identified the muzzle flashes, Missouri's shells were already halfway through their lethal journey. When they arrived, they didn't knock, they trespassed. One shell plunged through Musashi's upper deck, passed through layers of armor designed to resist every known projectile of the 1930s, and detonated deep inside the engineering spaces. The explosion ruptured fuel lines, igniting thousands of gallons of oil. Flames shot through open hatches like demonic tongues. Compartments went dark as generators failed. Men screamed for breathing masks, slamming watertight doors before the fire swallowed entire corridors. Damage control teams were heroic, no question, but heroism doesn't stop internal overpressure. The shockwaves from a 16-inch shell create transient forces capable of snapping steel beams thick as telephone poles. Bulkheads bent inward, pipes burst, electrical panels detonated like miniature grenades. Musashi wasn't taking damage, she was being hollowed out from the inside. And the psychological effect? Devastation. Japanese officers trained for honorable combat, broadside duels, visible enemies, mutual risk. But this wasn't a duel. It was remote execution. They couldn't see the Missouri. They couldn't calculate range fast enough. They couldn't return fire with accuracy. They were fighting a ghost with a calculator. Then came a hit that transformed the situation from catastrophic to terminal. A shell penetrated near Musashi's starboard side and detonated adjacent to an ammunition handling room. The resulting blast wasn't cinematic. It was surgical. It didn't blow the ship apart, it weakened her skeleton. Steel has limits. Every explosion stressed the hull. Metal fatigued, rivets loosened. The ship that once symbolized Japanese indomitability was now a wounded colossus bleeding energy, steam and hope. Musashi's speed dropped. Pumps struggled. Smoke choked passageways. The ship that was supposed to outlast anything began losing the one resource no battleship can replace: time. Her captain faced a truth harder than steel. Once structural damage compounds, even super battleships don't sink elegantly. They collapse, they suffocate, they die slowly, brutally, and publicly. Missouri's fire control officers noticed the change instantly. Slower target, reduced maneuverability, compromised integrity. The next salvo wouldn't just hurt, it would exploit weakness. The order was given, and the guns prepared again. Shells were loaded, charges rammed, elevation corrected. Bearings confirmed. The Americans weren't hunting anymore. They were finishing. Musashi's crew, now coughing from smoke and oil fumes, scrambled to maintain systems that no longer obeyed them. Pumps failed under pressure. Turbines lost efficiency. Fire mains burst. Communications degraded. Men who once believed they served aboard a floating empire now served aboard a dying monument. The battlefield had shifted. There was no longer a fight between two warships. There was a single truth. One side had physics, the other had faith. Only one survives that equation. The next salvo was not fired to test range or gauge response. It was fired to collapse whatever was left of Musashi's resistance. By now, Missouri's ballistic computers had achieved something terrifying: predictive dominance. They weren't simply tracking a ship, they were anticipating its death throes. Every adjustment Musashi made, course, speed, slight rudder change, was already accounted for in the firing solution. If Musashi turned, the shells would meet her there. If she slowed, they would arrive sooner. There was no escape trajectory. The Pacific had turned into a firing chamber. Missouri's guns elevated once more. Powder bags weighing nearly 100 pounds each were rammed into the breaches. Shells, taller than the sailors who loaded them, slid forward with mechanical inevitability. The breeches locked, hydraulic recoil cylinders primed, electric firing circuits armed. No speeches, no cheers, just a final confirmation of mathematics. Battery ready. When the guns ignited, the horizon blinked. Shockwaves rippled across Missouri's deck, shaking every bolt, every pipe, every rib of her steel anatomy. The shells, 2,700-pound armor-piercing beasts, left the barrels with a muzzle velocity approaching 2,500 feet per second. Each one carried more kinetic energy than a locomotive at full speed. These weren't munitions, they were verdicts. Musashi tried to maneuver, but her rudders fought damaged hydraulics. Her turning radius widened. Her once proud engines strained against flooding compartments. She was no longer a warship. She was a target too large to hide, too wounded to fight back, and too slow to outrun the laws of trajectory. The incoming shells struck with a violence that defies metaphor. One slammed into Musashi's belt armor, an area once considered impregnable. But armor designed for 1930s artillery wasn't built for American 1940s physics. The shell penetrated, delayed, then detonated. The explosion reverberated through the ship's internal girders, steel supports designed to distribute stress. Instead, they transmitted destruction. Compartments buckled, bolts sheared. Pieces of the ship's skeleton started behaving like shrapnel. Another shell plunged through the deck and exploded near auxiliary boilers. The blast ruptured steam lines, releasing superheated vapor that scalded steel and flesh alike. Men didn't scream because of smoke. They screamed because the air itself became a weapon. Damage control teams, already exhausted, faced an impossible calculus: patch holes faster than Missouri could make them. They couldn't. No one could. Musashi's bow dipped slightly, imperceptible to an untrained eye, catastrophic to anyone who understood ship integrity. A dip meant water, water meant weight, weight meant drag, drag meant death. Once the bow goes, gravity finishes the job Missouri started. You can fight guns, you cannot fight gravity. The Japanese command structure faltered. Radios crackled with desperate orders, counter-flooding, rerouting power, isolating fires. But commands are meaningless when the ship beneath you is losing its ability to obey. Musashi's internal pumps, once capable of moving tons of seawater per minute, now fought leaks at a rate that exceeded their capacity. Every blast from Missouri wasn't just an explosion, it was a subtraction of seconds. Then came the moment war historians mark as the irreversible break. A shell detonated so deep within Musashi's hull that engineers later concluded it compromised her longitudinal strength, the spine of the ship. A battleship is a beam. When the beam bends, it dies. You can armor turrets. You cannot armor inevitability. Crew members reported eerie sensations, floors vibrating differently, doors misaligning, bulkheads groaning under stress. Ships speak before they die. Musashi was screaming. Missouri's bridge crew saw the bow drop further. They didn't celebrate. Professionals don't celebrate physics. They apply it. And somewhere on the command deck without fanfare, someone uttered the words that sealed destiny. Target is losing coherence. Translation: Musashi was no longer fighting the Americans. She was fighting herself and losing. Musashi's identity was built on three pillars: armor, thickness, gun caliber, and national pride. But steel corrodes, calibers misfire, and pride doesn't float. As Missouri's salvos continued, Musashi transitioned from a weapon of war into a wounded giant whose every breath cost her structural integrity. Japanese command expected damage. They did not expect disintegration. When a super battleship starts to lose alignment, when decks warp, when girders flex, when stress propagates through rivets, the entire architecture of naval confidence collapses with it. The next barrage landed with merciless precision. One shell penetrated below Musashi's WWII turret, entering a region previously believed unreachable. Engineers had once boasted this area could survive direct hits from any naval gun in existence. They never imagined a weapon that bypassed armor by weaponizing mathematics. The detonation didn't ignite flames, it ignited consequences. Structural beams shifted, turret bearings jammed, elevation gears seized. Musashi's proud forward battery, the symbol of her offensive might, was reduced to dead weight. Meanwhile, auxiliary systems fell like dominoes. Electrical conduits ruptured, cutting power to sections of the ship responsible for coordinating damage control. Communication lines flickered, leaving officers shouting orders into static. Pumps that once pushed seawater out now sputtered, choked by debris and ruptured piping. Fires burned unchecked in magazines, forcing crews to flood them intentionally to avoid catastrophic explosions. Every solution created a new weakness. Every defense became a liability. Missouri's fire control team didn't just see damage, they saw decay. Their radar tracked Musashi's wobbling course, the telltale sign of rudder misalignment or power loss. They adjusted elevation a fraction of a degree and prepared the next salvo. These weren't shots fired into hope, they were shots fired into inevitability. American doctrine in World War II didn't aim to survive duels. It aimed to eliminate opponents before duels began. Then came an impact that historians still reference when discussing naval trauma. A shell penetrated below the waterline, detonating near Musashi's port engine room. The blast tore through turbines, sheared control cables, and turned multi-ton machinery into shrapnel. Engineers inside were thrown against bulkheads as steam and oil erupted in scalding jets. The engine room became a furnace. Men who rushed in to help were swallowed by the inferno. Musashi's speed dropped again. A battleship that once knifed the Pacific at over 27 knots now crawled at barely half that. The horizon no longer held options. It held a deadline. Flooding increased exponentially as compartments buckled. Every gallon of seawater that entered didn't just add weight, it twisted the ship's spine. Naval architects call it hogging, the upward bend of the bow and stern relative to the middle. Once it begins, the vessel stops being a ship and becomes a physics experiment that ends in only one result. Missouri's captain noted it. Hogging meant the ship's own weight was fighting against her. Gravity had joined the American attack. And gravity never misses. Japanese sailors, once shouting orders with confidence, now moved in silence. Not fear, silence. They understood what engineers later confirmed. Musashi was losing structural cohesion. Her bones, the beams, the welds, the stress-bearing elements, had begun to fail. No amount of courage can weld a ship back together mid-battle. Another salvo, another concussion. This one detonated near fuel tanks, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. The plume wasn't just a tactical disadvantage, it was a lighthouse announcing surrender, not intentional surrender, but mechanical surrender. Ships don't raise white flags, they raise black smoke. Observers aboard Missouri watched it rise. They didn't cheer. Warriors don't celebrate inevitability, they witness it. The Musashi, a floating prophecy of Japanese dominance, was becoming something else entirely, a memory preparing to drown. The human mind can ignore pain, smoke, and fear. It cannot ignore water. When seawater crosses a certain threshold inside a battleship, the vessel stops behaving like a war machine and starts behaving like a coffin. Musashi had reached that point. Her lower decks filled faster than pumps could compensate. Compartments sealed to prevent flooding now trapped men inside pockets of heat, fumes, and desperation. The ship's once legendary armor, celebrated as proof of Japanese naval genius, now worked against her. Armor resists explosions. It does not release pressure. It turns damage into captivity. Missouri's next salvo needed no dramatic introduction. The guns thundered again, each blast ejecting flame and smoke with an authority that bordered on ritual. The shells soared, invisible to the eye but undeniable to destiny. The range was dialed in, the target compromised, and the physics irreversible. American naval artillery didn't hope to land hits. It scheduled catastrophes. One shell struck near Musashi's bow, detonating inside a forward bulkhead. The explosion ruptured watertight compartments, allowing seawater to surge in, unopposed. The bow dipped further. Observers noticed it visibly. A battleship's bow does not dip without reason. It dips when buoyancy fails. Musashi's crew attempted counterflooding, filling starboard compartments to balance the ship. But counterflooding is a losing game when the ship is bleeding faster than it can heal. Every corrective action reduced reserve buoyancy, pushing the ship closer to a threshold from which no vessel returns. Pumps groaned under strain, valves jammed, and emergency systems flickered as electrical circuits sparked around saltwater intrusion. Engineers reported structural bending. Once the keel begins to flex, the ship isn't damaged, it's dying. Missouri's fire control radar registered Musashi's slowing speed, taking note of her reduced maneuverability. The targeting solution now required fewer corrections. The Missouri wasn't firing salvos anymore, she was administering doses. Each shell was a surgical strike designed not to kill instantly, but to remove the ship's ability to resist drowning. Musashi's secondary batteries tried to fire, spitting traces into empty horizon, but their shots were symbolic, frantic gestures of defiance rather than threats. Japanese gunners aimed at a ghost. Missouri remained outside visual range. Her presence was defined only by explosions and mathematics. Then came the hit that sealed the Musashi's fate. A 16-inch shell pierced the deck near midships, traveled through armored layers, and detonated adjacent to machinery spaces critical for power distribution. Darkness swept across multiple decks. Communications died. Pumps stalled. A super battleship forged from national pride now relied on flashlights and shouted orders, technology reduced to volume. A new sound emerged from Musashi's hull, metal deforming. It's not loud, but it's unmistakable. Steel doesn't scream, it groans, it warns. And when the spine of a ship begins to groan, you're not fighting the enemy anymore. You're fighting time. Men slipped on oil-coated floors as fires burned unchecked. Bulkheads grew hot enough to blister skin on contact. Smoke reduced visibility to inches. Air tasted like metal. Every breath was a negotiation. Damage control officers faced an impossible decision: save the ship or save themselves. Heroism doesn't stop entropy. The bow continued sinking, dragging the ship lower into the sea. List increased. Ammunition had to be jettisoned. Torpedoes were pushed overboard. Anything that added weight became an enemy. But removing weight cannot reverse a ship's death spiral when the keel is compromised. Naval architects describe it clinically: loss of longitudinal strength. Sailors describe it less academically: the ship is breaking in half. Missouri's bridge crew watched as if reading a report already written. No panic, no confusion, just confirmation. The execution was entering its terminal phase. Musashi was no longer a fortress. She was a stone tied to her own legacy. The Pacific doesn't care what a ship once meant. The ocean has one rule: everything floats until it doesn't. Musashi's officers no longer discussed tactics. They discussed minutes. Damage reports weren't status updates. They were countdown markers. The bow had submerged far deeper than any damage control protocol could justify. Crewmen who once spoke with the confidence of Imperial Navy pride now whispered questions no doctrine had ever prepared them to face. How does a battleship die? It doesn't explode instantly. It doesn't vanish beneath the waves in a single dramatic plunge. It unravels, piece by piece, system by system, hope by hope. The list increased past 12 degrees. That number sounds clinical until you try walking on a steel deck tilted like a rooftop. Men slid toward railings. Equipment rolled without guidance. Gravity no longer aligned with the ship's architecture, making every movement an argument with physics. Missouri had entered the final stage of naval dominance: observation. She didn't need to fire more shells. Her guns were silent, not from mercy, but from completion. American officers studied Musashi through optics and radar, tracking the super battleship's deterioration like surgeons observing a failing patient. The warship that once embodied Japanese industrial power now had the tragic dignity of something grand collapsing with awareness. Below decks, the scene bordered on apocalyptic. Stairwells became waterfalls. Every opened hatch released a tidal wave of salt water mixed with oil. The sound of rushing liquid drowned out verbal orders. Men tried using hand signals, but smoke erased visibility. In some compartments, the water level rose past knees, then waists, then chests. Panic didn't come all at once. It came quietly, like exhaustion refusing to leave. Musashi's engines still pushed forward, barely. Power flickered, turbines howled unevenly, and propellers churned water they no longer commanded. Engineers poured every breath into coaxing another knot of speed, not to escape Missouri's guns. They were already beyond that horizon. But to buy time. Time to evacuate. Time to pray. Time to understand what went wrong. The truth was brutal. Nothing went wrong. Everything worked exactly as designed, just not for Japan. American naval architecture had matured into a doctrine where range, firepower, and radar turned distance into assassination. Musashi wasn't outgunned at close quarters. She was outgunned before she ever saw her killer. The hull groaned again, louder this time, a metallic protest that rippled across the ship like an omen. Some crewmen stopped what they were doing, not by choice, but because instinct demanded stillness. When steel speaks, sailors listen. The bow lurched downward another degree. The list increased. Tools slid. Shell casings rolled into corners. The ocean no longer fought Musashi. It escorted her downward. She was heavy in all the wrong directions. Survivors began lining the deck. Some carried personal effects. Others held nothing. Empty hands were lighter for swimming. Officers tried maintaining order, but the ship itself dictated urgency. Lifeboats were deployed. Rafts thrown overboard. Sailors hesitated at the rail, staring into a sea that had no promise of rescue. And yet, in those final moments, something astonishing happened. Men saluted the ship. Not their captain, not their emperor. The ship. That steel mountain had been their shelter, their identity, their nation afloat. To go down with her wasn't suicide, it was loyalty made visible. Meanwhile, Missouri watched in silence. Her guns pointed skyward, not as threat, but as monument. Executioners don't linger near corpses. They let gravity certify the verdict. Musashi's stern lifted, bow swallowed deeper. Exhaust stacks coughed smoke into air that no longer belonged to machinery. The ship's weight shifted so dramatically that even the ocean changed tone as it flowed around her hull. A beast built to command the Pacific now struggled to remain part of it. Everyone aboard understood the truth. Musashi was no longer a warship. She was an obituary waiting for punctuation. There comes a moment in every sinking where hope stops pretending. Musashi had reached that moment. The ship no longer listed. It leaned like a dying giant trying to kneel before the ocean that claimed it. The bow dipped so sharply that men on the forward deck could see waves lapping over steel, once meant to intimidate entire fleets. The Pacific did not rush in violently. It entered with the calm confidence of something that had already won. Bulkheads buckled one after another. The internal skeleton of the ship, the very ribs of her industrial anatomy, snapped under impossible torsion. Engineers later described it not as metal failing, but as metal surrendering. The warship's frame groaned like an animal in pain, a guttural metallic howl that vibrated through every compartment. Even those already in the water felt it through their bones. Musashi's massive pagoda-style superstructure tilted far enough that signal flags drooped sideways instead of down. Lifelines, once taut and ready for combat, sagged uselessly. Ladders twisted out of alignment. Every component designed for vertical orientation now mocked its designers by pointing nowhere. Sailors trying to escape found the angles against them. A simple staircase had become a cliff, a flat deck transformed into a canted sheet of steel slicked with seawater and oil. Some crawled, some slid. Others simply fell and didn't stand up again. The warship itself had become an obstacle course designed by catastrophe. The stern, still momentarily afloat, rose higher, proof of flooding so catastrophic that buoyancy was no longer a principle, but a rumor. Propeller blades emerged from the ocean like relics, dripping Pacific water that seemed eager to reclaim them. For a ship this size, over 73,000 tons when fully loaded, the act of lifting its stern into the air was not dramatic. It was obscene. Physics shouldn't allow it. Yet there it was, towering above survivors like a tombstone sharpened for emphasis. Crewmen who once boasted that Musashi was unsinkable now watched her drown. Confidence had evaporated. Pride lay scattered like debris. Men who believed they served the mightiest battleship ever built now realized they were participants in a historical correction. Japan had built a monster. America built the bullets that killed it. A final explosion echoed, not from American fire, but from deep within Musashi's drowning heart. Compressed air tanks ruptured, ammunition stores popped like knuckles of a dying giant. Compartments imploded, sending geysers of oil-stained water skyward. Steam ventilated from the shattered boiler rooms, turning the air into a ghostly mist. Some sailors screamed, others went silent, choosing dignity over despair. Then the ship paused. Not physically, emotionally. There's an eerie stillness when a massive object accepts its fate. The listing stopped increasing, the hull ceased groaning. Even the ocean hesitated, as if waiting for a cue. Survivors later described that moment as the most terrifying silence imaginable. Not absence of sound, but the presence of inevitability. And then gravity finished what American gunnery had started. Musashi tipped past rescue, past theory, past legend. The bow plunged. The stern rose. The entire ship pivoted into a vertical descent, like a building collapsing through its own foundation. The ocean swallowed thousands of tons of steel without ceremony. Men jumped, others held on. Some chose the sea, some chose memory. The last part of Musashi visible above water was her flag, Japan's radiant red sun. For a heartbeat it fluttered defiantly, refusing to acknowledge defeat. Then the sea erased even that. The Pacific drew a curtain over the wreck, sealing it in darkness. Musashi did not sink like a ship, she fell like a continent. And when the bubbles cleared, a silence spread across the waves so complete it felt like the ocean itself was stunned. When Musashi vanished beneath the Pacific, the water didn't just close over steel, it closed over an era. For decades, every naval strategist believed the battleship was the ultimate arbiter of sea power. Thick armor, colossal guns, reinforced citadels, these were supposed to guarantee dominance. But on that day, it became brutally clear. Supremacy didn't belong to whoever built the biggest ship. Supremacy belonged to whoever understood the rules of physics and bent them into a weapon. American naval doctrine had evolved beyond tonnage and ego. The USS Missouri didn't win because she was larger. She won because she was smarter, wired with radar-directed fire, equipped with gunnery systems that could calculate trajectories while a ship pitched through waves, and armed with projectiles capable of punching through armor once believed invincible. The engagement against Musashi wasn't just a military victory, it was a funeral for an entire global belief system. Japan had gambled everything on the Yamato-class philosophy. Build a Leviathan so massive, so monumental, that no gun could pierce its skin. They assumed intimidation was strategy. They forgot that America doesn't fear monsters. America manufactures countermeasures. The world watched. Admirals took notes. Intelligence agencies revised doctrines overnight. Military academies rewrote course material. The ripple effect was seismic. Nations understood something that would reshape the next half-century. Steel was not enough. Size was not enough. Tradition was not enough. Precision was king now. Range was its crown. Data was its bloodline. After Musashi's demise, global naval spending pivoted. Programs dedicated to super-heavy battleships were halted, scrapped, or ridiculed. Countries that dreamed of building colossal flagships suddenly shifted focus to carriers, submarines, electronic warfare, and guided weapons. The ocean didn't become smaller, it became smarter. Missouri's victory did something even more important. It carved fear into the collective psyche of every nation that dreamed of challenging American sea power. Not fear of a ship, but fear of a system. Fear of an industrial machine capable of turning theory into velocity, ideas into explosions, and mathematics into death. From British Admiralty rooms to Soviet naval headquarters, one conclusion echoed. If America can do this to Musashi, what could they do to us? Naval architects studied the wreckage data. Engineers pored over shell penetration analysis. Politicians, men who couldn't tell a bulkhead from a boiler, understood only one thing. The Pacific now belonged to a country that treated war not as art, but as engineering. Yet, something unexpected happened. Musashi's end didn't erase her legacy, it amplified it. In defeat, she transformed from instrument of empire into monument of caution. Museums would one day speak her name with reverence. Divers would descend to her grave. Documentaries would dissect her demise. She became a symbol, not of Japanese power, but of technological arrogance. Meanwhile, Missouri became myth, a floating cathedral of American conviction, the ship where treaties were signed, where enemies surrendered, and where naval warfare itself evolved. A vessel that didn't just fire shells, it fired doctrine. Historians argue about many battles. They debate strategy, missteps, weather, timing. But on this point, there is no debate. Musashi's death was not random. It was engineered. It was predicted. It was inevitable the moment someone in an American design bureau asked a simple question no other navy dared confront. What if accuracy is deadlier than size? That question detonated on the Pacific, and the shockwave never stopped. The ocean remembers Musashi's fall, not as tragedy, but as transformation. The world remembers Missouri, not for what she destroyed, but for what she ended. An age, a mindset, a myth. What happened out there wasn't just a clash of steel. It was the moment human ingenuity proved that no empire, no doctrine, and no legend stands unchallenged. The USS Missouri didn't merely fire shells. She delivered history's verdict. Her 16-inch Mark 7 guns didn't roar. They spoke, and the Pacific listened. But none of this existed without the men who stood behind those weapons. Sailors who trained until muscle memory replaced fear. Engineers who calculated trajectories with the precision of surgeons. Gunners who understood that every round they loaded carried the weight of a nation's resolve. These weren't machines, they were Americans, determined, relentless, uncompromising. And on the other side, the crew of the Musashi fought with honor. They served a titan, they believed in a dream, and they faced death without surrender. History remembers that. The sea remembers that. Today, both ships rest, one in steel, preserved as a monument, the other in silence beneath the waves. One symbolizes evolution, the other consequence. We honor them all, the vessels, the weapons, the hands that operated them, and the era they transformed. Because in war, victory is not merely who survives. Victory is who redefines what is possible.